Someone left a comment on my last video asking if I would do another video on the topic of the book of Joel, in view of the fact that this week the Watchtower's study article is about the attack of the northerner, and it goes into Joel a little bit. So, okay, I'm happy to accommodate. I don't always keep up with, the current Watchtower study and all of that, but it is a worthy topic. And I guess I'm somewhat of an expert on the book of Joel. I know that may sound arrogant, presumptuous, or whatever, but more than 20 years ago, back in the mid-90s, I suddenly took up this obsession with the prophets. And the book of Joel in particular captured my attention, and I must have read it 30 times over the course of several months, as my thoughts formed on it, and I kept going back to it to confirm, is that the way I'm reading it? So that was around 1996 going into 1997. And I was just tinkering around with the computer. My wife had a laptop with her work, and I didn't know how to type really, but I still don't. But this book of Joel captivated me, and I wrote a letter, an essay, and sent it to Bethel, and sent another. I think I sent two, maybe 6-8 pages, explaining to them that this northerner could not possibly represent Jehovah's Witnesses. Jehovah intervenes to compensate his people for the damage that they suffered from this locust attack, which is called the northerner, right? So I didn't know what to expect. I mean, up until that time, really, I believed everything the Watchtower had written. I mean, I was a loyal society man. I've told you that before, but now I was seeing some different things, And of course, Watchtower didn't respond to me in any way. So a brother, an elder in my congregation, is very supportive, and he knew one of the governing body members, and he said, "Why don't you give so-and-so a call? He's pretty open-minded, So, all right. And this was the topic. I introduced myself and told him that this was a big mistake, that I had been anointed, But we got into this book of Joel, and he wouldn't hear of it, that the Watchtower could not have it right, And he basically reproved me. How dare you? You think you're somebody. If Jehovah wants us to understand anything, he'll tell us directly, not from some guy out there. Well, that was probably 1997, I think, 8. So now, 22 years later, the Watchtower says, we've been thinking this over. And, for the last 100 years, we thought, but we only considered one verse. I mean, they say that. If you read that article, it's maddening. If you consider the context, and they use the exact same reasoning that I presented to this governing body member back in the 90s, but now it's their new insight, right? It's kind of amusing to me, but the question is, why has it taken so long? And I won't even say for them to get it right, because they still don't have it right. I think probably I heap so much scorn and ridicule upon their previous interpretation that these locusts represent Jehovah's Witnesses, and people could see, well, yeah, he's right. This doesn't make any sense. So that, they got together and did a little damage control, apparently. Now, it's interesting, though. The book of Joel it's like many prophecies. It's sealed. It's like a message in a bottle type of thing. And it's Jehovah conversing with his people at a point in the future. When this locust attack, the attack of the northerner, comes about, then Jehovah's voice will be relevant. And so how does the book of Joel start off? Wake up, you drunkards. Wake up, you drunkards. Sweet wine has been cut off from your lips. And I think we all know he's not talking about literal drunkards, literal wine. It harmonizes with the 28th chapter of Isaiah. The drunkards of Ephraim. And it says Jehovah has covered the heads of his prophets and visionaries. So they claim to see. Now, after 100 years, they claim, well, we kind of realize that this northerner's not Jehovah's Witnesses. But they still don't have it right. And the commenter, when he asks if I do a video on Joel, he said the Watchtower has again shut the mouth of Jehovah. And I think his observation is precisely right on the mark. So now that they figured out who this northerner is, they say, oh, it's Babylon. When Babylon destroyed Jerusalem. Ha! No future application at all. And then Jehovah compensated when he poured out his Spirit on Pentecost. Bada bing, bada boom, that's it. And they have shut the mouth of Jehovah. Of course, they say that because the Apostle Peter, on the day of Pentecost, quoted from Joel to explain the outpouring of Holy Spirit. In the last days, he said. Yep. But there's so much more to the prophecy of Joel because it culminates at Armageddon. Jehovah challenges the nations to come down to the valley of Jehoshaphat, and he's going to judge them. Well, that ain't happened yet, and they know it hasn't. So really, what is the book of Joel about? Well, it harmonizes with all the other prophecies. But the reason I like Joel is because it's so concise. 3 chapters, you can read it fairly quickly. And it's sort of like the key to unlocking our understanding of God's purpose. Something to keep in mind is that Jehovah owns certain things. You can say, well, yeah, God owns everything. He created everything. And of course, that is true. But God is very generous, too, and he gives things. This is yours, here, your life. But he retains certain things as his own possession, just like you and I have possessions. You might be a property owner, or you own a car, you own certain clothes, and so forth. If you're married, you really own your spouse. They're devoted to you, you're devoted to them, and well, we can go back to the Garden of Eden. When God created Adam and Eve, he told them, it's all yours. Every fruit-bearing tree, all the vegetation, have all the animals in subjection, but don't touch this one tree. It's mine, more or less. That's what God said. Don't touch it, don't eat it. If you do, you will die. So we appreciate this principle of ownership. Jehovah says he he owns our blood and the blood of every creature, because the blood is the life. It represents the life. And so God owns our life. We can't give our blood away. We can't take someone else's blood. We can't give our life away or take someone else's life. We are owned in that sense. But Jehovah, with the coming of Christ, Jehovah owned Jesus, right? And Jesus, with his blood, bought persons for God to be his, what? Special possession. So this principle of ownership applies to certain people. People who have been called, been anointed to come into union with Christ. They're owned by Christ and they're owned by Jehovah. That's why in Revelation, for example, the 144,000 are standing upon Mount Zion with the Lamb, and they have written on their foreheads the name of the Lamb and the name of the Father. And a slave would maybe have a tattoo of his owner's name on his head. Or it's like putting a brand on a cow to show which ranch he belonged to or whatever. So these persons that Jehovah purchased through Christ's sacrifice and who been brought into this covenant arrangement, that is the Israel of God. Paul used that expression. And Jehovah's Witnesses, of course, understand this. These are the deeper things of the Scriptures. When the Bible talks about a restoration of Israel or God's dealings with Israel, we know he's not talking about the physical nation of Israel, not in that modern application. Whatever nation state is in the Middle East right now has no relevance to Bible prophecy. So the Watchtower now is pretending to interpret this book of Joel, and they say, well, yeah, the locusts come into Israel. Well, let's read a little bit there. Yeah? Well, I should have brought it up. Now, in the first chapter of Joel, after he tells the drunkards to wake up, he says, "For a nation has come up into my land, mighty and without number. Its teeth are the teeth of a lion, and its jaws are those of a lion. It has devastated my stump, my vine, and turned my fig tree into a stump, stripping them completely bare and tossing them aside, leaving their twigs white." So again, with a little spiritual insight, we know that God is not talking about a literal fig tree or a literal vine. It's what these represent. He's saying he has ownership of them. Well, aren't Christians called to produce fruit for God? Jesus referred to himself as the vine. Stay in union with me. You cannot accomplish anything if you're disconnected. I am the vine, you are the branches. This don't sound good, does it? It has devastated my vine and my fig tree. And that's interesting. I remember Jesus was in his ministry walking down the road, and he went to get some fruit off of a fig tree, and it didn't produce anything, and he cursed it, and it died. Now, verse 8, this is interesting. "Wail as a virgin wearing sackcloth does for the bridegroom of her youth." Well, Jesus has a bride, doesn't he? the bride class, those who are expecting to be part of the kingdom. Remember, Jesus gave the parable of the wise and foolish virgins who are waiting on the bridegroom. They were expecting to be invited into the marriage. And what happened? Some of them didn't make it. So imagine that. It's your wedding day and something terrible happens and you're left there at the altar. Wail as a virgin. So take off that pretty wedding dress and put on this burlap sack, which is sackcloth, and wail for the bridegroom of your youth. Now, verse 9, grain offering and drink offering have ceased from the house of Jehovah. Well, we don't offer up literal sacrifices, do we? Like the Israelites did. They had various prescribed rituals that they would go to the temple and have the priests perform in their behalf. But again, the Apostle Paul said, we offer God sacrifice through our mouths, through our ministry. And now all that stopped. Well, doesn't it say in the 8th chapter of Daniel that this fierce-looking king will come against the prince of princes, and he'll even drag some of the stars down from heaven? Who are they? Well, the Apostle Paul said that anointed Christians had seats in the heavenly places along with Christ. So they're taken down. They're crushed. They had an exalted place. They were performing a ministry. And now all that's over. That's what the book of Joel is about, my friends. Look, I was right about the northerner. I'm right about this too. But the Watchtower can't admit it because everybody would go insane. Right? Jehovah's Witnesses would go insane. This is confronting us? Yeah, that's exactly right. The priests, the ministers of Jehovah, are in mourning. Who are the priests? Anointed priests. Jehovah has a house of kings and a royal priesthood. And he expects them to declare abroad the excellencies of the one who called them out of darkness. Well, why would they be in mourning? Because all of that is over. What is up to that time functioned as the house of Jehovah is now abandoned. Farmers are dismayed. Vine dressers wail because of the wheat and barley, for the harvest of the field has perished. Well, we know what the harvest symbolizes. Jesus used that illustration on several occasions. Lift up your eyes, the fields are white for harvesting. And beg the master to send out more workers into the harvest. And that's what Jehovah's Witnesses have been doing, working in the field, bringing in the sheaves, so to speak. That's an old gospel song, isn't it? Well, the field has been devastated, and the ground mourns, and the grain has been devastated. The new wine is dried up, and the oil has failed. Well, with this COVID lockdown, Jehovah's Witnesses might be in a little better position, and maybe, a little imagination, they can bridge the gap. But now just imagine a government order, cease and desist. That's basically happened in Russia, right? The other day, a couple of witnesses were sentenced to 6 years in prison for being part of a radical group. The ministry in Russia has virtually come to a standstill. Headquarters in St. Petersburg, beautiful branch office, gone. Devastated, you might say. It's still there, but the Watchtower can't use it. They don't own it anymore. Just like Jehovah was saying, someone has come up into my land. Well, think global and think of it in the United States where the Watchtower is headquartered. You know, 3 main facilities in New York, in Warwick and Patterson and Wallkill. So suddenly the ministry will cease. Proclaim a fast, call for a solemn assembly to the house of Jehovah your God, and cry to Jehovah for help. Woe because of the day, for the day of Jehovah is near, and it will come like a destruction from the Almighty. Yeah, please read the book of Joel. I mean, if you haven't, the Watchtower, it says that, this northerner has no modern application. It was merely Babylon destroying Jerusalem. But in that instance, the prophet Jeremiah told the Jews, if you want to survive, fall away. In other words, come out with your hands up. Surrender to the king of Babylon. You won't have your freedom anymore, but you'll have your life. If you resist, and many did, and they stayed in Jerusalem, fighting to the end, Jehovah said, you will die of the pestilence, food shortage, and the sword. So their only hope was to give up and accept Jehovah's punishment. Well, in this instance, Jehovah says, go into the house of God and beseech him. Well, that's because it's spiritual, isn't it? So there's a difference, because the book of Joel is not talking about the destruction of ancient Jerusalem. It doesn't even mention the Babylonians. It does mention Israel a few times, but as I say, we know that has a spiritual counterpart. And it mentions Jerusalem as well, because in the 3rd chapter, it says, no more will the nations come into Jerusalem. We're not talking about the literal city. It's what Jerusalem represents. And I've talked about this many times, maybe worth repeating, but Christianity began in Jerusalem, right? That's where the Apostle Peter was on the day of Pentecost when he talked about the book of Joel. Jesus had specifically ordered them not to leave Jerusalem until the Holy Spirit was poured out. And they stayed in Jerusalem for a long time. They witnessed in the temple on day and night. And they were active in Jerusalem. The apostles that was basically their headquarters. When Paul had to discuss this matter of circumcision, he went up to the older men in Jerusalem. So Jerusalem is synonymous with Christ's congregation. But Jehovah says he brings this locust attack upon his people. It's his military force. So the way we reconcile that, Jesus said he would be with his people all the days until the conclusion. And he also said the good news must be preached first. First before what? Before the conclusion. The conclusion is the harvest. It's not stretched out over years and years and years. In fact, when the harvest ends, it's talking about in Joel, when it's lost, that means there's no more preaching, no more teaching, no more baptizing disciples. It's over. And those who are in are then judged. And that's why Jesus likened it to separating weeds from the wheat. And he says they're in his kingdom, in his congregation. And he will tell the angels to remove the weeds out from his kingdom, along with all the stumbling blocks. So this devastation that will be brought about by Jehovah's military force, this worldly agency, before it, the Bible says that it's like the Garden of Eden. Behind it is devastation. You know, the book of Joel starts out, before Jehovah even addresses the drunkards, he said, tell this to your sons and let them tell it to their sons. Nothing like this has ever happened before or ever happen again. Well, that's the very same terminology that Jesus used when speaking about the Great Tribulation. Nothing like it has ever occurred before or will ever occur again. And didn't Jesus also say that Jerusalem would be devastated, desolate during the tribulation? That's his congregation, his holy place. That's why Christians are told to put on sackcloth and go into mourning. Oh, you know, there's an interesting parallel with that too. In the 11th chapter of Revelation, the two witnesses come along dressed in sackcloth. And a few verses before we're introduced to them, the holy city is trampled underfoot. For how long? 42 months. When Jehovah comes to compensate his people for the loss brought upon them by this northerner, he says, I will compensate you for the years that the locusts devastated you. The years. How many years is that? Nobody knows. No, I do. 3.5 years. Well, I think we're getting close. You know, thanks for the suggestion about doing a little video on Joel. Maybe, I don't know, maybe 2 or 3 more people will wake up. It's possible. I'm hopeful. All right.